All right, team, grab your coffee, circle up, and let's get into it. Welcome to this explainer on the HAZWOPER standard. I want you to treat this like our morning tailgate safety briefing. Look, I am not here to just read a textbook to you, and we definitely aren't here just to check off a compliance box to keep management happy. I've spent decades out there in the hot zone. I'm talking pulling drums out of Superfund sites, dealing with nasty highway rollovers, the whole shebang. I've seen what happens when things go exactly according to plan, and trust me on this, I've seen the absolute nightmares when they don't. So this masterclass, it's a reality check. It's your guide to staying alive, keeping your crew safe, and making absolutely sure you walk through your front door to your family at the end of the shift. So focus up, and let's dive in. Give me liberty, I've already got death. Now, a resident of Love Canal actually stood out there holding a sign with those exact words back in 1978. I want to start our briefing right here, because it is absolutely crucial you understand that the rules we're about to go over, they weren't just dreamed up by some bureaucrat sitting up in a comfy air-conditioned office. No way. They were written in blood. They were born out of real, devastating human tragedies. You see, for decades after World War II, this country went through rapid industrialization, but there was almost zero oversight on where the toxic waste ended up. Companies were literally just burying 55-gallon drums of nasty chemicals right in the dirt. At Love Canal, they built an entire neighborhood and an elementary school right on top of 21,000 tons of toxic waste. People got terribly sick, kids were born with birth defects, entire families were displaced. It was just a complete heartbreaking disaster. So let's trace how this chaos finally forced the government's hand. Back in 1969, the pollution was so unbelievably bad that the Cuyahoga River in Ohio literally caught on fire. Yeah, a river on fire. Then came the Love Canal evacuation in '78, and, I remember the old-timers talking about the early days at the Valley of the Drums in Kentucky, guys just walking right into toxic soup in their everyday street clothes, simply because nobody knew any better. The public outcry from these domestic disasters was massive, and when you add in international horrors like Bhopal, where thousands died, people were terrified, and rightly so. Congress had to act. In 1980, they passed CERCLA, which we all know out on the site as the Superfund. But here was the kicker. Suddenly, we had these massive, highly toxic cleanup sites all over the country, but the workers going into them had absolutely zero standardized safety protocols. We had guys in the field with mismatched gear, zero training on chemical hazards, basically just trying to figure it out on the fly. The risk was just unacceptably high, and it was that exact chaos that led directly to OSHA finalizing the 1910.120 standard in 1989. Okay, so what does that standard actually mean for us on the ground? Let's break down the alphabet soup. HAZWOPER stands for Hazardous Waste Operations and Emergency Response. It falls right under the federal OSHA regulation 29 CFR 1910.120. In plain English, this is the ultimate federal safety standard designed specifically to protect you, the workers who are exposed or even have a reasonable possibility of being exposed to safety or health hazards from hazardous substances. It lays down the law for mandatory training, your personal protective equipment, medical surveillance, and site control procedures. Whenever you step foot onto a contaminated site or roll up to a chemical spill, this standard right here is your career protector, and much more importantly, it's your lifesaver. Now, if you've ever actually tried to read through the official OSHA 1910.120 standard, well, it's a brick. It's totally packed with heavy bureaucratic jargon and regulatory legalese that'll make your eyes glaze over in about 5 minutes flat. But don't worry, you don't need a law degree to survive out there. And I promise I am not going to sit here and read this regulation to you line by line like some sort of robot. My goal in this explainer is to translate all that dense regulatory text into real, practical, on-the-ground survival tactics. We're going to take the rules off the printed page and put them right into the mud, the trenches, and the hot zones where we actually do our jobs. To really wrap your head around if and how this standard applies to you, imagine you're walking onto a job site right now. This standard essentially divides our work into 4 main operational buckets. First up, we have government-mandated cleanups. These are your uncontrolled hazardous waste sites, like your EPA Superfund sites or state priority lists. Second, we've got RCRA corrective actions. This means the cleanup of historical contamination at active permitted facilities. Third is TSDF operations. That stands for treatment, storage, and disposal facilities. We're talking places like hazardous waste incinerators or specialized landfills. And finally, number 4, emergency response, the unplanned, sudden releases of hazardous substances, pretty much regardless of where they happen. It kind of helps to look at how these operations contrast with one another. On one hand, you have your government and RCRA cleanups. These are typically slow, highly methodical operations. You're mapping out zones, you're slowly excavating soil, or you're carefully pulling buried drums out of some decades-old landfill. It's planned remediation. But on the flip side, consider TSDF and emergency response. A TSDF handles ongoing, daily hazardous waste streams. It's a controlled industrial environment, sure, but with constant exposure risks. An emergency response, well, that is just controlled chaos. You're dealing with a ruptured pipeline, a train derailment, or a tanker rollover on the highway, where the exact nature of the hazard might be entirely unknown when you first pull up. The standard covers both extremes, but the rules apply a bit differently based on the specific risks of what you're dealing with. Which brings us to the million-dollar question. Who exactly needs this training? I want you to really think about this for a second. When you picture a HAZWOPER worker in your head, who do you see? Do you just picture the HazMat tech or maybe the firefighters sweating it out inside a fully encapsulated level A chemical suit? I mean, sure, they absolutely need it. But what about the guy running the bulldozer? What about the general laborer who's just out there digging a trench to repair a utility line on an old industrial property? Or even the site supervisor standing 50 feet back with a clipboard? Let's take a look. Here is your actual HAZWOPER roster. We're talking general laborers, heavy equipment operators, HazMat technicians, incident commanders, supervisory personnel, and TSDF employees. Basically, if you have the potential to be exposed to hazardous substances above the established limits, or if you're working in an environment that poses a health or safety hazard due to these chemicals, this training is required. Period. From the trench digger waist deep in the dirt all the way up to the incident commander calling the shots from the command post, it is absolutely non-negotiable. Even the environmental scientists taking soil samples and the project managers have to be trained. You literally cannot wing it out there. Look, here is my supervisor's reality check for you. HAZWOPER is your lifesaver, and it's your career protector. Frankly, I do not care how many years you've been turning dirt or responding to emergency calls. Hazardous materials do not care about your experience. They don't play favorites. This standard exists for one reason and one reason only, so that every single one of you goes home to your families tonight exactly the way you arrived this morning. It teaches you how to recognize hazards before they bite you, what protective gear to actually wear, and, crucially, the proper decontamination procedures, because the absolute last thing any of us wants is to accidentally track invisible secondary contamination right into our living rooms and expose our kids. We do not mess around with that, and this training is what stops it from happening. So that leaves us with one final, pretty important question to wrap up this initial briefing. What level are you? Because here's the thing, HAZWOPER is not a one-size-fits-all training program. The guy operating the backhoe doesn't necessarily need the exact same training as the specialist who's patching a leaking chlorine cylinder in a level A suit. The standard dictates very specific hours and field experience requirements based on your exact role and your exposure risk. So take a quick breath, think about your specific duties on the site, and get ready, because we are going to dive straight into the specific training levels and our requirements next, and you definitely won't want to miss it.
In Section 1, we covered the what and the who of HAZWOPER, why the standard even exists in the first place. Now we're picking up right where we left off and diving straight into the 29 CFR 1910.120 training matrix. Let's get right into this, because understanding these requirements, well, it's literally the foundation of everything we do out there in the hot zone.
So, I want you to ask yourself honestly right now, which HAZWOPER level are you? Just picture your exact role out there on the site. Are you the one pushing dirt? Are you sampling groundwater? Or maybe you're the one responding to an emergency chemical release. Let me tell you, getting this wrong isn't just some administrative paperwork error. The wrong answer costs companies thousands of dollars in wasted training time. Or, far, far worse, it puts an undertrained person into an immediately dangerous environment. And that can cost someone their life.
Okay, site workers, 40-hour versus 24-hour. Let's start with paragraph E of the standard, which covers these site cleanup workers. Over my decades doing this, I have seen way too many people, and frankly, a lot of safety managers too, conflate these two basic levels. They just assume HAZWOPER is this one-size-fits-all 40-hour block. It is absolutely not.
Look at how these training levels match up with what you're actually doing. Let's break down the real difference. If you're a 40-hour general site worker, you are the heavy-duty crew. You're regularly exposed above permissible exposure limits, or PELs. You're the folks relying on a respirator and level B or C protective gear just to stay alive while you're removing hazardous substances.
Now contrast that with the 24-hour occasional worker. This is for folks doing very specific limited tasks. Maybe you're doing some land surveying or groundwater monitoring, but you're doing it on fully characterized sites where exposures are documented to be below the PELs. Absolutely no respirators required. It's really the difference between executing a surgical strike on the outer edge of a site versus standing smack in the middle of the contamination.
Now, what's really interesting here, and absolutely crucial, is the field experience requirement. Listen, you cannot learn HAZWOPER just by staring at a screen or sitting in a classroom. The 40-hour worker requires a minimum of 3 days of actual, supervised field experience. The 24-hour worker, they require 1 day. I can tell you straight from my own days as a HazMat team leader, reading about decontamination procedures in a manual is one thing. Actually getting in the dirt, sweating inside a chemical suit, and trying to manage your air supply while a trained supervisor is watching your every move, it's entirely different. You have to experience that physical and mental toll to actually know what you're doing before a real emergency happens.
So the magic number here is 16. People are always coming up to me asking, hey, I've got my 24-hour certification, but my site conditions just changed, and now I need to wear a respirator. Do I have to start the whole class all over again? The answer is no. You just need 16 hours of additional off-site training, plus 16 hours of additional supervised field experience to upgrade from a 24-hour worker to a full 40-hour general site worker. It just builds right on top of what you already know.
All right, let's look at emergency response, the 5 tiers. We're shifting gears here from planned site cleanups over to paragraph Q, emergency responders. Listen up on this one, because this is where the danger, the unpredictability, and your tactical responsibilities escalate very, very quickly. Look at this breakdown. See how these training levels match different roles on an emergency scene? Starting right at the top. First responder awareness. You witness a release, you recognize the hazard, and you report it. That's it. You take 0 defensive or offensive action, period. Drop down a level to operations. That's 8 hours of training. Now you're taking defensive actions, like diking a spill from a safe distance just to prevent it from spreading into a drain. But look at that huge jump to HazMat technician with 24 hours of training. That leap shifts a worker from being a bystander doing defensive containment to someone who is actively going in to aggressively plug a deadly pressurized leak. Then, of course, you have your specialist providing the deep technical support and the incident commander with 24 hours of training who assumes absolute overall control of the entire incident scene. I really want to focus specifically on that leap from step 2 to step 3, that jump to the 24-hour technician level. Look, I've been on scenes where panic sets in. Human nature just makes people want to rush in and play hero. But if you only have awareness or operations training, you stay back. I have seen exactly what happens when undertrained folks try to take offensive action against a hazardous release. It turns a local spill into a mass casualty event. You never ever play technician and go on the offensive unless you have the training, the hands-on competencies, and the right gear to back it up.
Moving right along to supervisors and the annual refresher. All right, let's transition into the administrative guardrails that hold this whole safety system together. And I'm speaking directly to any bosses, site safety officers, or foremen watching this explainer right now.
We've got what we call the supervisor add-on. Listen, if you're managing these crews, you cannot just sit in the air-conditioned trailer and point fingers. A supervisor needs the exact same 40-hour or 24-hour baseline training as the crew they're directing out in the field. Plus, you need 8 extra hours of specialized management training at the time of your job assignment. That extra block covers how to actually develop the site safety and health programs, how to manage the PPE programs, and how to execute spill containment protocols. As a leader, you have to know the hazards intimately to protect your team.
And that brings us to the single most important number for keeping your career and your certification alive: 8.
8 hours. That's the annual refresher required for all certified HAZWOPER workers and responders. It does not matter if you work at a treatment, storage, and disposal facility, an uncontrolled waste site, or on a HazMat team. You need this. It must be completed within 12 months of your last training. It's what keeps you competent, covers any regulatory changes, and reviews new hazards. Let me give you some salty field wisdom right here. Do not let this lapse. It's not an OSHA suggestion, it's a hard deadline. If you let it expire, your employer or the site safety officer might make you repeat the entire 40-hour or 24-hour initial course from scratch before you can even step foot back on a covered site. That is a massive amount of financial and operational pain, all just for missing a simple 8-hour window.
I want to leave you with this thought right here. HAZWOPER site-specific training is where compliance meets real-world safety.
It transforms regulatory knowledge into practical competence. We're bringing this part of the briefing to a close, but I need you to remember that these hours, whether it's 40, 24, 16, or 8, they aren't just boxes to check off for some regulatory auditor. They are the tools you use to recognize hazards in real time. They help you make informed decisions under immense pressure. And ultimately, they are the difference between going home safely to your family at the end of the shift or becoming a statistic. So, I'll ask you this. Are you ready to identify the invisible hazards on your site? Because now that you know your training level and your exact operational role, you need to know exactly what you're walking into when you cross that fence line. Stay right here, grab some water if you need it, because in our next masterclass section, we're diving straight into site characterization and hazard assessment. Let's get to work.
We just wrapped up the hours and training levels, but now we're transitioning from classroom theory to the reality of stepping onto a live, potentially hazardous site. This is where the rubber meets the road, folks. The absolute most important question you can ask before doing anything is, what are we dealing with? In our world, we call answering this site characterization. It is the critical first step before a single boot hits the ground. I've been doing this a long time, and I'll tell you right now, going into a site blind is the fastest way to get people killed. Under OSHA 1910.120, a qualified person has to perform a preliminary evaluation before anyone physically crosses into a potentially contaminated area. You got to know what's waiting for you in the dirt, the water, and the air.
So how do we actually do that safely? Well, we follow a strict 3-phase reconnaissance process. Phase 1 is your off-site assessment. This happens way before you even pack the trucks. You're looking at historical maps, old aerial photos, utility records, you're doing your homework. Then comes Phase 2, on-site reconnaissance. This is a cautious, controlled initial visual walkthrough. You're doing perimeter air monitoring, looking for biological indicators like, say, dead vegetation or animals, and just confirming if your Phase 1 homework matches reality. And finally, Phase 3 is your detailed on-site characterization. This is where we get into the weeds, deep air and soil monitoring, testing groundwater, and formally documenting the specific risks.
Okay, moving on to identifying the enemy, our site hazards.
Once we're in that detailed characterization phase, we have to map out exactly what dangers the crew is going to face. We break these down into 3 main categories. First up, chemical hazards. Look, it's not always just leaking drums of glowing green sludge, right? Sometimes it's asbestos fibers in an old building. Or, here's a real field scenario for you, toxic sulfur gases that silently build up in monitor wells near peat bogs. A worker pops the cap off a well to take a sample, inhales that gas, and goes down instantly. Then you have physical hazards. Unstable ground and heavy machinery are obvious, sure, but the silent killer on most HazMat sites? It's actually heat stress, especially when your crew is sealed up in impermeable chemical suits. And finally, biological hazards. If you're cleaning up an abandoned medical facility or an illegal dump, you're actively hunting for bloodborne pathogens, infectious waste, and even local threats like toxic plants.
Next up, we need to talk about the perimeter, specifically our site control zones.
Once we know exactly what hazards we're dealing with, we have to draw hard lines in the dirt. The whole point here is to keep contamination from spreading to the public or, worse, tracking it back into our own clean areas. Take a look at how the zones are laid out here. There's a universal architecture to a hazardous waste site. First, you have your exclusion zone, also known as the hot zone. This is the heavily contaminated area where the actual cleanup, drum staging, or active remediation happens. Next, you step back into the contamination reduction zone, or the warm zone. This is your transition area. It houses the decontamination corridors, the physical stations where we scrub down personnel and equipment. Finally, you have a support zone, the cold zone. This is the clean area. It's where your command post sits, where you park the emergency vehicles, and where folks can safely take off their gear and drink some water.
To enforce all this, we rely on strict boundaries. The outer boundary of the exclusion zone is officially called the hotline. And listen, I cannot stress this enough. The hotline must be strictly, physically marked. You use hazard tape, fencing, barricades, or clear danger signs. It is an absolute barrier to prevent unauthorized entry. If you don't have the right training, the right medical clearance, and the right protective gear, you do not cross this line, period.
Similarly, we have the contamination control line. This is the hard boundaries separating your warm zone, where the decon happens, from your clean support zone. And guys, this requires strict physical discipline. I've seen what happens when crews get sloppy. Absolutely no contaminated gear, no dirty boots, and no unwashed samples cross this line into the support zone. Why? Because the second you bring a contaminated tool into the area where your team is eating lunch or taking a breather, you've compromised the entire site and poisoned your own people.
All right, let's talk about your lifelines, the buddy system, and the site safety officer.
We've covered physical boundaries, but now we need to talk about the human element, the specific people assigned to watch your back when things inevitably go sideways. Now, the clinical OSHA definition of the buddy system is basically organizing employees so that each person is observed by at least one other employee. Pretty dry, right? But let me give you the real mentor to mentee explanation of why we do this. You never, ever enter a hot zone alone. Visual contact with your buddy is literally your only lifeline. If you suffer a chemical exposure, if you rip your suit, or if you collapse from heat stress, your buddy is the one who initiates the rapid rescue. Without them, a minor incident turns into a fatal recovery operation. Watch your buddy, and they will watch you.
Overseeing all of those buddy teams is your Site Safety Officer, or SSO. The SSO is the primary contact for all things occupational health on the site. They're the ones conducting your daily tailgate safety briefings before you cross that hotline. They're constantly monitoring the work parties for signs of cold exposure, fatigue, and heat stress. But most importantly, and I really want every supervisor listening to hear this loud and clear, the SSO has the absolute authority to stop work. If the SSO sees a hazard shifting or a worker struggling, they can shut the entire operation down without question. I don't care if you're the project manager or the company owner. If the SSO says stop, you stop.
Let's move into our debrief and look at some common supervisor pitfalls.
Speaking of supervisors, let's look at where things usually fall apart. These are the fatal errors I see time and time again in the field that lead to OSHA citations and put crews in body bags. Number 1. Failing to distinguish a minor maintenance spill from a full-blown HazMat emergency. This leads to underprotecting your responders. Number 2, selecting personal protective equipment based on procurement costs instead of verified chemical compatibility charts. Look, if you buy cheap gloves that aren't rated for the specific solvent on your site, that chemical is going to break right through, causing silent, chronic exposure to your workers. Number 3, and honestly, this one drives me crazy, using generic copy-pasted site safety and health plans. An SSHP must be tailored to the specific hazards of your site. Laziness here gets people hurt. And finally, failing to conduct continuous air monitoring during active digs. Conditions change when you move dirt. If you aren't monitoring the air, you are walking into an invisible minefield.
So, we know the hazards, we've drawn our zones, and we have our lifelines in place. But the ultimate question remains, how do we physically armor ourselves before stepping over that hotline and into the hot zone? Well, keep your coffees handy, because in the next part of this explainer, we're going to dive straight into personal protective equipment and break down PPE levels A through D. Let's get into it.
We just finished characterizing the site, right? So we know exactly what kind of fight we're walking into today. Now, we need to talk about the gear that's actually going to keep you alive out there. We're talking personal protective equipment, or PPE.
So you know what's in the dirt, and you know what's floating in the air. But choosing the right armor to wear, honestly, that is the single most critical decision you or your safety officer are going to make all day. I mean, it is quite literally the only barrier between you and a career-ending, or worse, a life-ending exposure. Let's break down exactly how we categorize that armor.
Take a look at this breakdown directly from OSHA up on the screen. We divide our gear into 4 distinct levels, A, B, C, and D. This covers everything from your fully encapsulated walking on the moon style suits all the way down to your basic hard hat and steel-toed boots. And the level we pick? Well, that depends entirely on the chemicals present, their concentrations, and honestly how hard you're going to have to physically work while wearing it.
All right, first up, let's talk about the heavy artillery, the absolute maximum protection available. Levels A and B. We are talking about extreme environments here, the places where the unknowns are high and the hazards will take you out fast. When you are walking into an atmosphere that is immediately dangerous to life or health, an IDLH environment, and you know the chemical can absorb right through your skin, you are zipping up into Level A. It's a fully encapsulated, positive pressure suit with your air tank, your SCBA, worn on the inside. You are in your own little isolated bubble. Absolutely nothing gets in. Now check out the contrast between A and B on the screen here. With Level B, you still get that SCBA, so you've still got the absolute highest level of respiratory protection, but we downgrade the suit itself. Why do we do that? Well, because in this scenario, we know what the substance is, and while it might totally wreck our lungs, we know it's not going to burn through or absorb into our skin, so we swap out that big encapsulating bubble for heavy-duty chemical-resistant clothing.
Look, I've run plenty of initial response teams in my day, and I'll tell you right now, Level B is our absolute workhorse. When we first roll up to a spill, we just don't trust the air. We absolutely need that positive pressure clean air on our backs. But we also need the physical dexterity to swing wrenches and turn valves to stop the bleeding, you know? Level B hits that sweet spot perfectly.
Okay, once things are stabilized, we move on to routine work. Let's look at our day-to-day workhorses, Level C and D.
So, once we've characterized the site, measured the contaminants, and stabilized the emergency, we move into routine cleanup. And that means we can finally shed those heavy, exhausting air tanks. Welcome to Level C. Here, you swap the tank for an air-purifying respirator, an APR, and a standard splash suit. It is way more comfortable for a long, 12-hour shift. But listen to me, complacency kills here. You can only wear this if you know exactly what the chemical is, you're within the filter limits, and you have confirmed there is at least 19.5% oxygen in the air, period.
I want you to literally lock this matrix on this screen into your brain right now. Knowing the exact threshold between needing supplied air on your back in Level B and being able to rely on a simple filter cartridge in Level C is what's going to keep you breathing. Level C is fantastic for extended field work, for sure, but it depends 100% on constant, accurate air monitoring.
And finally, at the bottom of the hierarchy, we have Level D. This is your minimal protection, meant for nuisance contamination only. We're talking standard work coveralls, a hard hat, safety glasses, and boots. Notice something missing? There is zero respiratory protection. You only walk out there in Level D when you are absolutely mathematically certain the air is clean and the entire environment is fully characterized.
Now, for those of you stepping up into leadership roles, we need to talk about the supervisor's burden, upgrading and downgrading this gear.
Listen up closely here, because picking the suit at the morning safety briefing, that is barely half your job. OSHA puts the compliance burden squarely on the supervisor's shoulders. You run the PPE program. That means you don't just hand out gear and point your crew toward the hot zone. You have to train them on how to put it on, how to take it off safely, how to inspect it for tears, and how to decontaminate it. A single rip turns a $5,000 Level A suit into a very, very dangerous Level D suit.
Out in the dirt, conditions change in a literal heartbeat. Say your backhoe operator is digging and suddenly hits a buried, unexpected pocket of solvent. Vapor levels are going to spike instantly. As a supervisor, the second your meter's alarm or a new dermal hazard is even suspected, you pull your crew back out and you upgrade their gear immediately. No hesitation.
But here's a piece of real-world field wisdom you need to remember. More armor is not always better. I have seen way more guys drop from heat stroke wearing a fully sealed Level B suit on a hot July afternoon than I ever have from actual chemical exposure. Overprotecting causes massive physical stress, it completely kills your peripheral vision, and it destroys your crew's ability to communicate. And that right there is exactly why downgrading your PPE is just as crucial. If the hazard lessens and your air monitors actually prove it, you've got to get them out of the heavy gear. Moving a crew from Level B down to Level C gives them back their mobility, gives them better communication, and provides critical relief from the heat. Believe it or not, downgrading at the right time actually makes the entire operation safer.
Before we pack it up today, we need to face some hard truths. Let's look at some common mistakes I've seen on the job.
Read through these bullet points carefully, because you simply cannot afford to repeat these mistakes. Putting an air-purifying respirator on in a low-oxygen trench, that is a death sentence. A filter cannot magically create oxygen out of thin air. Slapping on Level C before you actually know what the chemical is. You are just gambling with your lungs. And picking gear just because it's a few bucks cheaper, that cost is eventually going to be paid with someone's life. Always check your glove compatibility. And seriously, respect the heat stress.
I want you to keep this official summary table from the Los Alamos Manual fresh in your mind. Because out there, your life and the lives of the men and women working on your crew rely on you matching the exact suit and the exact filter to the exact threat in front of you, task by task.
Now, everything we just talked about today, upgrading, downgrading, literally trusting your life to a piece of rubber, depends entirely on one single thing: data. You can't make these calls blind, because if your meter is wrong, then your suit is wrong, and you might not go home. So here's the big question: how do we absolutely prove the air is safe enough to breathe? Well, let's pack up our gear and head straight into our next lesson on air monitoring to find out.
All right, team. You're all zipped up in your PPE from our last module, so let's keep moving. Welcome to the Hazard Recognition and Monitoring section. You know your suits, you know your respirators. But let's get one thing straight right out of the gate. That Level B suit you're wearing, it's just your armor. It tells you absolutely zero about the actual battle you're walking into. So picture this. You're fully geared up, supplied air is flowing, you've got your buddy right beside you, and you're staring down the fence line of an uncontrolled waste site. What is your very next move before you cross that line? Listen, if your answer is just start walking, we've got a serious problem. That PPE only protects you against the hazards we actually know are there. It's a barrier, it's not a magic force field. If you walk in blind, trusting just your rubber and plastic, you are literally rolling the dice with your life. And in this line of work, we don't guess, we measure. Which brings us right to the invisible threat. Honestly, airborne chemicals are one of the biggest, scariest dangers out there simply because, well, you can't see them. I have been on emergency scenes where everything looked perfectly fine. No smoke, no weird puddles on the asphalt, totally calm. But the air was lethal. This is exactly why continuous air monitoring is a hard, non-negotiable requirement under OSHA 1910.120. I've literally watched site conditions flip from completely safe to IDLH, immediately dangerous to life or health, in an absolute heartbeat. The wind shifts, a drum gets breached, maybe an excavator hits a pocket of gas, and suddenly the very atmosphere is trying to take you out. Your air monitors, they are your eyes and ears for what you can't see. Okay, so how do we actually do this? You always test the atmosphere from the outside perimeter first. And look at the steps here on screen. There is a strict, absolutely non-negotiable order to this. Number 1, oxygen level. Number 2, explosive atmospheres, or your LEL. And number 3, toxic atmospheres. Now, why this exact sequence? Well, it's about survival, sure, but it's mostly about the science of your gear. Obviously, you test oxygen first to see if the air can even sustain life. But technically, your combustible gas meters, the ones sniffing out explosive atmospheres, actually require a normal amount of oxygen to give you a true reading. If the oxygen is low, your LEL monitor might straight up lie to you. And out there in the hot zone, a lying monitor is a fatal mistake. Speaking of oxygen, I need you to burn this number into your brain. 19.5%. That is the absolute bare minimum oxygen level by volume that you need to survive without a supplied air respirator. Normal, everyday air is right around 20.9%. So if you're looking down at your 4-gas monitor and you see that oxygen number dropping down toward 19.5, you need to realize right then and there that something else is in the air, pushing the oxygen out. I've seen monitors drop scary fast down in low-lying trenches, and when that alarm starts screaming, you are getting out of there. Unless you're on supplied air. If you drop below 19.5, your judgment gets foggy, your coordination tanks, and pretty soon, the lights just go out. So, what exactly are we using to hunt down these invisible toxic threats? Take a look at this instrument. This is a photoionization detector, or a PID. Honestly, it's one of your best friends out there for finding volatile organic compounds, or VOCs. Here's the quick and dirty on how it works. It pulls in site air right past a high-energy UV lamp. If a chemical's ionization potential is lower than the energy of that lamp, boom, the chemical gets ionized and your meter spikes. For example, a standard 10.6 EV lamp is going to catch benzene, no problem, but it won't see something like carbon monoxide. PIDs are absolutely brilliant for finding where a gas is most concentrated, but you've got to remember one key limitation. They won't tell you exactly what chemical you're dealing with, only that something is definitely out there. But hey, the PID isn't the only tool in the truck. Let's look at the rest of your field arsenal. We've got combustible gas indicators, or CGIs. These are the workhorses specifically checking your lower explosive limit. They make sure you aren't casually strolling into a bomb. Next up, flame ionizing detectors, or FIDs. These are a little different. Instead of UV light, an FID actually uses a tiny hydrogen flame to ionize and sniff out organic gases and hydrocarbon vapors. And finally, colorimetric indicator tubes. I gotta tell you, I love these things for field work. They're just little glass tubes packed with a chemical reagent. You snap the ends off, hook them to a hand pump, draw a specific volume of air through, and just wait for the color to change. They are perfect for a quick, down and dirty spot check when you suspect one specific deadly gas is hanging around. Now, all this fancy equipment, it really just gives you raw numbers. What actually gives those numbers meaning is this, right here, the Safety Data Sheet, or SDS. Look at this binder. I see rookies all the time treating this like it's just boring, bureaucratic OSHA paperwork. Let me fix that mindset right now. This is your survival playbook. Under the Hazard Communication Standard, your employer is legally required to have an SDS for every single hazardous chemical on site. And it has to be accessible to you. It lays out exactly what makes a chemical dangerous and specifically how it's going to try to hurt you. When you are geared up in the hot zone, you do not have time to stand there reading all 16 sections of an SDS like it's a novel. You need to know exactly where to look fast. Section 4, that's your immediate first aid measures. Section 8 dictates your exposure controls and the exact PPE you're going to need. Section 11 hits you with all the toxicological info, basically the acute and chronic health effects. But listen to me, I want you to pay very close attention to Section 9, physical and chemical properties. Why? Because this is where you find vapor density. If that vapor density number is greater than 1.0, that invisible gas is heavier than air. It is going to sink right down into that trench you're excavating. If it's less than 1.0, it's going to rise up. Knowing what's in Section 9 literally tells you whether you should be holding your air monitor high in the air or down at your boots. Now, a quick warning here. I need you to avoid a very common trap. Staring down at your monitor all day can give you severe tunnel vision. You get so hyper-focused on chemical and airborne hazards that you completely miss the rest of the picture. Can a toxic vapor kill you? Absolutely. But you know what else is just as deadly? Physical hazards. I'm talking about heavy excavators swinging around a chaotic site, open trenches, moving parts. What about deafening noise that ruins your hearing so you can't even hear the evacuation siren? Or heat stress. Heat stress is a massive killer, especially when you are wrapped head to toe in a non-breathable chemical suit. And please don't forget the biological hazards, things like bloodborne pathogens, mold, or infectious waste. True hazard recognition means keeping your head on a swivel for the whole shebang. Let's also clear up a really dangerous misunderstanding I see out in the field all the time, and it has to do with radiation. There is a massive, crucial distinction between radiation exposure and radioactive contamination. If you have radiation exposure, it means the particle or wave energy is passing right through your body, kind of like getting a chest x-ray at the doctor. You are exposed to it, yes, but you aren't necessarily contaminated. Radioactive contamination, on the other hand, means the actual physical radioactive material, the dust, the liquid, the source itself, has actually gotten onto your clothes, your skin, or even worse, you breathed or swallowed it. If you are contaminated, you literally become a walking exposure source to every single person around you until we can get you cleaned up. And all of this brings us to the folks watching the big picture. For those of you stepping up to lead, the site safety and health supervisor carries a really heavy burden. Under HAZWOPER, they have the authority and the absolute duty to verify that everyone is complying with the Health and Safety Plan, or the HASP. They're the ones constantly watching the crew for signs of heat stress and fatigue. They know every single evacuation route cold. But most importantly, they rigorously enforce the buddy system. No one, and I mean no one, ever enters a hot zone alone. Not ever. If your buddy goes down, you are their only lifeline. And the supervisor is the person standing by, making sure that chain is never, ever broken. All right, so you followed the playbook. You did your pre-entry air monitoring. You read your PID like a pro. You managed to not get run over by a backhoe, and you successfully knocked out your task in the hot zone. Great job. Congratulations on a safe entry. But guess what? The job isn't over. You are currently covered head to toe in whatever nastiness you just walked through. Which brings us to the most critical phase of leaving the site. You survived the entry. Now, how exactly do we get you out clean? Hold that thought, because we are diving straight into decontamination procedures right after this. Keep your gear close, let's keep moving. So you did the hard work in the last section, your air monitors are clear, and you're stepping away from the release. Awesome. Now we're rolling right into Section 6 of our HAZWOPER Masterclass, Decontamination Procedures. But before we get too comfortable, let me ask you a serious question. Something I ask all my rookies. Is the hot zone really the most dangerous place on site? Because, a lot of folks think the danger is totally over once they turn their backs on the spill and start walking away. The adrenaline drops, they let their guard down, and they think the job is done. But I'm here to tell you, as someone who has spent decades out in the field, the danger isn't over just because you walked away from the immediate release. In fact, if you mess up this next phase, you're literally taking that danger with you. And that brings us exactly to what we are trying to prevent here, secondary contamination. This is the transfer of hazardous substances from the work site to clean areas, to your coworkers, or even to your family. Listen to me on this one because this is where it gets really personal. If you skip decon or you just do a sloppy job of it, you aren't just risking a chemical burn on your own arm. You could literally be dragging a highly toxic substance into the break room where your crew is eating lunch, into the cab of your truck, or worse, straight into your own home. I've seen secondary contamination cause massive heartbreaking problems that could have so easily been avoided. We decon so we don't bring the hazard home. Period. Take a look at the site map we have here. It perfectly illustrates how we physically map out our escape route. You got the hot zone where the actual danger is. The cold zone, where the support staff is hanging out, and sandwiched right in the middle is the warm zone. See those red arrows? That right there is the contamination reduction corridor. When you're in the hot zone, the only acceptable way out is straight down that specific corridor. You don't wander off to the side, you don't take a shortcut to the trucks, you walk the line. Now, the crucial thing to understand is the philosophy behind that corridor. The golden rule of decontamination is decreasing contamination. Every single step you take on that line, every single station you pass through, is specifically designed to move you from the most contaminated outer layers of your gear to the cleanest inner layers. You are leaving the absolute worst of it behind at the front of the line. By the time you step over that final control line into the cold zone, you should be entirely clean. If you're not, well, the line failed. Out in the real world, this whole process actually starts before we even touch your suit. Notice that very first sign on the right side of the layout here, segregated equipment drop. Before we even lay a finger on your PPE, we deal with your tools. Why? Well, because tools, like your soil augers, heavy wrenches, or sampling monitors, they're heavy and they're usually covered in gross contamination. We drop them first on plastic sheeting so we don't cross-contaminate the rest of the wash line. And honestly, so you don't have to stand there holding heavy gear while you're exhausted and trying to get washed down. Once the tools are down, you step into the wash tubs. You can see a worker in full PPE here undergoing what we call a gross wash. You've got a worker breathing from an SCBA getting scrubbed down by a decon team member. We use long-handled brushes and compatible cleaning solutions here to physically knock down the absolute worst of the chemicals from the outer boots and gloves. We always start at the top of the suit and work our way down to the boots. It's thorough, it's methodical, and it's essential before we even think about unzipping anything. I know the regulatory text in OSHA 1910.120 can read a bit like a phone book, so let's break this whole flow down into 4 logical chunks so you don't get overwhelmed. First, you have the equipment drop we just talked about. Second, the gross wash and rinse, where we scrub the outside of your suit. Third is PPE doffing, which is the careful, step-by-step removal of your protective gear. And finally, the personal wash, where you clean your own body and get checked out by medical. If you can just remember these 4 phases, you'll always know exactly where you are in the process. Now for the specifics. The EPA does have a maximum layout. Check out this 19-step chart for a level B decon. I know. At first glance, it looks like a crazy complicated maze. You've got tape removal, boot cover removal, inner glove washes. It can look super intimidating, but I tell my crews all the time, do not memorize the numbers, understand the process. It's really just a methodical, careful peeling away of layers. You take off the outer boots, then the outer gloves, then the suit, then the inner gloves. It's literally just like peeling an onion from the outside in. And that brings us to the actual peeling process itself, doffing the suit. Here is a critical tip straight from the field. You should absolutely never be taking off a highly contaminated level A or B suit by yourself. A trained attendant who is also wearing proper PPE should unzip you from the back. They're going to peel that suit down and away from your body, rolling it inside out so the chemicals get trapped on the inside. You keep your inner gloves on, you maintain your balance on a clean absorbent pad, and you absolutely never reach out and touch the outside of that suit. Throughout all of this peeling and washing, there is one absolute rule you cannot break. Your SCBA, your self-contained breathing apparatus, is your final lifeline. Keep it on until the very end. The face piece is the absolute last piece of outer gear you remove. Why? Because as we are peeling your suit, we might agitate chemicals and create dangerous vapors right in your breathing zone. One invisible puff of ammonia or chlorine is all it takes, guys. We only drop that respiratory protection once all the skin risks are completely controlled and you are safely in a clean air zone. But what happens when things go sideways? Let's pivot for a second. Imagine you're managing a crew, and one of your workers suddenly goes down with severe heat stroke inside a fully encapsulated level A suit. It's 100 degrees out, they collapse, and they are totally unresponsive. Are you going to run them through a 19-step scrub down with a long-handled brush? Absolutely not. That brings us to the critical difference between standard decontamination and emergency decontamination. In a life or death emergency, we suspend the standard rules. Life safety overrides environmental procedures every single time, no exceptions. If a worker has a heart attack or severe heat illness, your priority is to get them out of that suit immediately. We use trauma shears to carefully cut the suit away, pulling it back to expose their chest and airway. We do a rapid, gross wipe down if we can, but if they need a defibrillator or an airway cleared, you delay decon to stabilize that victim. Just remember to wrap them in plastic or a blanket to protect the medical personnel who are trying to treat them. The decision aid flowchart you see mapped out here is exactly what site supervisors use to make that split-second call. It asks the hard questions. Is the decon method effective? Does it pose a health hazard? Can appropriate protective measures be instituted? In a chaotic emergency, you have to decide instantly if taking 2 minutes to rinse a worker will save their life from a corrosive chemical, or if that 2-minute delay will kill them because they aren't breathing. This right here is why we drill emergency decon constantly before we ever start the job. Okay, so crisis averted, the crew is safe, they've passed through the line, they're in the cold zone, job done, right? Not quite. Think about that mounting pile of contaminated gear at the edge of the line. Waste is waste. All that water you used to scrub the suits, the discarded gloves, the plastic drop cloths, the mess doesn't just magically disappear. It has now absorbed the hazardous substance, which means your decon line has just generated a massive amount of brand new hazardous waste that has to be dealt with. The EPA and OSHA are incredibly strict about how we manage this, as you can see in the breakdown here. Wash water has to be collected in catchment tubs and pumped continuously into sealed, DOT-approved drums. Disposable PPE goes straight into labeled hazardous waste bins. You can clean and inspect expensive gear like SCBAs for reuse, sure, but the runoff is highly regulated. Let me be clear. If you just let your contaminated wash water run off the plastic sheeting and down into a city storm drain, you aren't just looking at a fine, you are looking at severe criminal penalties under RCRA. Let's bring it in for a quick supervisor's huddle. Based on the regulatory data and decades of my own field experience, these are the most common, costly citations I see teams get hit with out in the hot zone. Number 1, discharging that wastewater into stormwater systems, just like we mentioned. Number 2, failing to actually put up caution tape and establish physical boundaries for the contamination reduction zone, so unprotected people just wander right through. Number 3, using cheap cleaning agents that actually react dangerously with the site chemicals. And finally, skipping air monitoring in the decon corridor. Vapors build up fast when you wash those suits, folks. You absolutely have to monitor the wash line. So, we've covered air monitoring, and now we know exactly how to set up a rock-solid decon line to get everyone out alive and clean. Folks, remember this. A successful response isn't defined by how quickly you stop the leak. It's defined by everyone going home safe without taking the hazard with them. But looking at all these steps, the equipment drops, the medical checks, the waste drums, you might be asking yourself, how do we possibly plan, organize, and budget for all of this before we even step foot on the site? You certainly can't just wing it. Stick with me because in our next section, we're going to dive deep into creating bulletproof site safety and emergency response plans. Let's keep rolling. All right, so you're clean, you've doffed your gear, and we've successfully wrapped up the decon line. Welcome to Section 7 of our HazWOPER Masterclass. Today, we're diving into site safety plans and emergency response. Let's look at the actual playbook that keeps you from getting dirty or worse in the first place. You know, I always tell my crews out in the field, decon is how we get out, but the Site Safety and Health Plan, the SSHP, well, that's how we go in. Under OSHA's 1910.120, this written plan is absolutely not just an administrative checkbox collecting dust in a binder in the site trailer. No way. It is a site-specific lifeline. It translates your company's broad safety policy into actual, practical survival on the ground. When you're out there in the hot zone looking at the SHSP on the screen here, remember, this is what dictates every single move you make to ensure you go home at the end of your shift. So, what exactly goes into the whole shebang? Imagine we're leaning over the hood of a work truck, looking at this master blueprint together. As you can see, the standard requires 10 specific elements. You got to start with a hazard analysis for each task. Then you map out training assignments, precise PPE requirements, and medical surveillance. It dictates your air monitoring frequencies, your site control measures, the decon procedures we just learned about, your emergency response plan, confined space entry procedures, and spill containment. Every single one of these 10 elements works together, like a giant puzzle. They dictate everything from the buddy system to the exact chemical cartridge you twist onto your respirator. But hey, listen up, because here is a massive warning for all you supervisors watching. It's a trap I see employers fall into all the time. I call it the generic trap. Do not, I repeat, do not just copy and paste a generic safety plan from your last job site. A generic plan completely fails to address the unique actual hazards of the dirt you're standing on right now. If your plan mentions hazards that aren't there and ignores the very real ones that are, your crew is going to lose total faith in it. You absolutely must make it site-specific. Or frankly, it's worse than useless. It's actively dangerous. Now, proactive planning is fantastic when things go right, for sure. It's what keeps the daily operations smooth. But let me ask you this. What happens when the worst-case scenario hits? What do you and your crew actually do when the alarm suddenly sounds, the situation goes south, and your operations instantly shift from proactive, controlled planning to reactive chaos? That's the exact moment we find out how good your emergency planning really is. And that brings us to the golden rule you see visualized right here. As this OSHA excerpt makes crystal clear, a written emergency response plan, or ERP, must be developed and implemented prior to allowing any employee response to a hazardous release. Listen to me on this one. You do not figure this out on the fly. Before anyone is ever allowed to respond to a spill or a ruptured tank, the plan has to be locked in, written down, and fully understood by every single person on that site. Your ERP is made up of critical lifelines, which you can see listed right here. It clearly defines roles and authority, safe distances, evacuation routes, emergency decon, and medical treatment. I remember a job years ago where a badly corroded drum ruptured unexpectedly, sending up this massive vapor cloud. It wasn't the PPE that saved us that day. It was the fact that every single guy on that crew knew exactly where the safe distance line was and the exact evacuation route to the upwind assembly point. Knowing those lifelines is what actually saves lives in the field when things go bad. But an incredible written plan doesn't do any good if it just stays tucked away in the supervisor's truck, right? That's where the tailgate huddle comes in. Take a look at these steps. This is your mandatory pre-entry briefing. Before anyone crosses into the exclusion zone, the site safety officer has to get everyone together. You review the specific hazards for the day's tasks, you check the PPE and decon setups, and you confirm your comms. You literally do not step foot in the hot zone until everyone looks you in the eye and confirms they understand the plan. And a non-negotiable part of that site control plan that we review in the huddle is the buddy system. Never, ever work alone. I don't care if it's a routine soil sampling task you've done 1,000 times. You must maintain visual contact with your buddy at all times. In the hot zone, you're looking out for them and they're looking out for you. You're watching for any signs of chemical exposure, rips in their suit, or the silent killer out there, heat stress. Your buddy is your immediate lifeline. Now, I want to point out a critical regulatory overlap that trips a lot of people up. Notice the comparison here on the screen. Out on hazardous waste sites, it is incredibly common to need entry into storage tanks, process vessels, or underground utility vaults. When that happens, your HAZWOPER standard, 1910.120, crashes right into the permit-required confined space standard, 1910.146. You have to comply with both. Your site safety plan must seamlessly integrate those confined space entry procedures. Let me be very clear about these danger zones. Confined spaces are simply not designed for continuous human occupancy. Because of the restricted entry and the extremely high risk of toxic or explosive atmosphere settling in them, strict entry procedures and continuous atmospheric air monitoring are absolute life or death requirements. You never, ever guess what the air quality is in a confined space on a HazMat site. You test it, and you continuously monitor it the entire time your people are inside. Speaking of compliance and planning, let's take a look at this table. These are the top OSHA traps, the most cited violations year after year across the board. We're talking fall protection, HazCom, where guys guess what's in the barrel instead of actually reading the label, respiratory protection, scaffolding, lockout/tagout. Now, I don't want you to look at these as just dry statistics. Frame these in your mind as highly predictable operational traps. When you're writing your SSHP, you know these are the exact areas where crews fail most often. So plan for them, train for them, and make absolutely sure your crew systematically avoids them. If we narrow it down to HazWOPER-specific work, this chart highlights 3 deadly compliance lapses we consistently see in the field. Number 1, inadequate PPE. Think choosing cheap gear based on procurement costs. Rather than actually checking the chemical compatibility charts, that leads to rapid chemical breakthrough. Number 2, missing air monitoring, leading to silent chronic worker exposure. And number 3, decon corridor failures, which result in dragging contamination completely off-site. Listen, these aren't just paperwork errors. They are physical threats to your crew's health. Another major, potentially fatal issue supervisors face is failing to know the difference between an incidental spill and an emergency release. Notice the crucial distinction here. An incidental spill? Well, it's minor. It doesn't pose a major safety or health hazard, and your regular facility maintenance folks can safely clean it up using basic hazard communication protocols. An emergency release, however, requires a fully coordinated HAZWOPER Level A or B response. Sending a maintenance worker with a mop into a ruptured tank scenario isn't a cleanup plan, it's a fast track to a fatality. You must accurately classify the spill immediately. So, I want you to think about this scenario. The plan is written, the site is fully characterized, the crew has been briefed at the morning tailgate huddle, and suddenly, the alarm just goes off for a major emergency release. The big question is, who is actually driving the bus? Who takes charge when the proactive plan turns into a reactive, high-stakes emergency response? Well, that is exactly what we are going to cover in the next section of this masterclass as we dive into the Incident Command System.
We're moving straight into Section 8, the Incident Command System, or ICS, under 29 CFR 1910.120.
Think of this section as your absolute survival playbook. I want you to ask yourself a serious question right now. Who is actually in charge when things go wrong in the hot zone? When an emergency pops off, multiple agencies show up. Sirens are wailing, adrenaline is pumping, and human nature makes people want to just rush right in and help. But if you don't have a strict, rock-solid structure in place, that well-meaning response turns into deadly chaos in seconds. Who's making the calls? Who is checking PPE? Who's tracking exactly who went into the hot zone? And more importantly, who came out? The ICS answers all of that. It stops that blind rush and forces a calculated, coordinated, and safe response.
Which brings us to this quote right here. Lack of coordination can be just as dangerous as the hazard itself. I cannot tell you how true this is. I've been on scenes where you've got facility personnel, the local fire department, state police, and private cleanup crews all pulling up at the exact same time. If nobody knows who's holding the reins, you get conflicting decisions. You might have one crew trying to ventilate a space, while another crew is aggressively trying to seal it up. The Incident Command System is built to kill that confusion. It's a standardized on-scene management approach that brings your people, your equipment, and your facilities under one coordinated roof. Guys, it is not just a bunch of OSHA red tape we have to follow, it is a literal lifesaver.
Take a look at the chart on your screen. Here is what the Incident Command System looks like when it is running like a well-oiled machine. Right at the top, you've got the Incident Commander. They are the ultimate boss on the scene, setting the big picture objectives. But they can't do it all, so they delegate. You have the Operations section. These are your tactical responders, actually out in the field doing the physical work. Then there's the Planning section, who draw up the incident action plan. Logistics is getting you the gear, the air tanks, and the support you need. And the Finance and Administration section is keeping track of all the costs. Under this chart, every single person on the scene has a specific job, and everybody knows exactly who they answer to.
But I want to zoom in on a very specific, absolutely crucial relationship here, the dynamic between the incident commander and the safety officer. Now, the IC establishes the overall strategy, sure, but the safety officer has a very special mandate under OSHA regulations. They are there specifically to evaluate hazards, and they hold absolute veto power. Let me be clear on how this works in the field. If the safety officer sees conditions out there that are immediately dangerous to life and health, what we call IDLH, they have the direct, unquestioned authority to alter, suspend, or completely shut down those operations on the spot. They don't have to ask the IC for permission. If the safety officer says stop, you stop. Period. It is the ultimate check and balance to make sure that in the heat of the moment, life safety is always the #1 priority.
The beauty of the ICS is that it's flexible. It scales up or down based on exactly what you're dealing with. Let's look at a scenario right out of the OSHA standard to show you what I mean. Imagine a small incident, say an overturned tank truck with a minor flammable liquid leak. The first responding senior officer pulls up, sizes up the scene, and boom, they immediately become the incident commander. They figure out the necessary actions and PPE. Now, because it's a small scene, this single IC might wear multiple hats. They might act as their own safety officer initially. But, and listen up, this is key, they still have to designate at least 2 other properly equipped employees as backup using the buddy system, just in case a rescue is needed. They handle it with a lean crew, and if they don't need outside help, the incident is closed safely without a massive mobilization.
But what happens when things get ugly and you do need to escalate? Who gets to do what? That brings us to 29 CFR 1910.120, paragraph Q6. This section outlines the 5 emergency responder training tiers. Listen to me on this one, folks, because this is where well-meaning people get themselves hurt. Your training level dictates your boundaries. Knowing your specific job and knowing your limits is what keeps you from becoming a victim yourself. You cannot just decide to be a hero and jump outside your training tier. Let's break down exactly what these 5 levels are and how they fit into the ICS.
We'll start with the foundational levels. Take a look at this breakdown. First is the first responder awareness level. These are the folks just going about their shift who happen to discover a hazardous release. Their only job, literally their only job, is to recognize the hazard, protect themselves, secure the area, and call for backup. They do not intervene. Stepping up one tier, we have the first responder operations level. This takes at least 8 hours of specific training. Ops level responders are allowed to take action, but only defensively. They stay back at a safe distance. Their job is to contain the release from afar. Maybe throw down some absorbent booms or block a storm drain. As an old captain used to tell me, an ops level responder's job is to just hold the line. They never go in to actually stop the leak at its source.
Now, what if we have to go on the offensive? That's where our hot zone workers come in, the HazMat technician and the HazMat specialist. Both of these levels require a minimum of 24 hours of specialized training, serious hands-on experience, and annual refreshers. The HazMat technician is your aggressive responder. They are the ones suiting up in Level A, fully encapsulated chemical suits, walking right up to that compromised container and physically turning the valve, patching or plugging the leak. They get their hands dirty. The HazMat specialist goes in with the technicians, but they bring the advanced brains. They have highly technical knowledge of specific chemicals, toxicology, and how containers behave under stress. They are the chemical experts guiding the mitigation strategy and talking to the environmental agencies.
And sitting at the very top of this whole incident hierarchy is our fifth tier, the on-scene incident commander. To be an IC during a HazMat emergency, you need at least 24 hours of training, equal to the operations level. But beyond that, you have to aggressively demonstrate that you know how to run the incident command system. The IC carries the heavy burden of directing the entire emergency response, managing the chain of command, and blending the facility's response plan with local and state emergency plans. It is a massive responsibility. You have to know the playbook inside and out, which is exactly why an annual refresher is strictly mandated by OSHA.
Now this perfectly illustrates why coordination is so critical. A real incident rarely stays inside the fence line with just your facility personnel. When you bring in an outside response, you're usually dealing with 3 distinct levels. Local government provides the police and fire departments, your traditional first responders. State government brings in emergency management and potentially the National Guard for huge disasters. And the federal level gets involved when you call the National Response Center at 800-424-8802 for significant releases. But here is a field reality you need to memorize right now. Unless you have arrangements made in advance, the second the local fire department or state police roll onto your site, they are going to assume command. If you want a coordinated effort instead of a turf war, you have to plan those interactions before the sirens ever start ringing.
When an incident gets big enough to involve all those different jurisdictions, we rely on something called multi-agency coordination systems, or MACs. Think of MACs as the overarching architecture. So while the ICS is managing the tactical, boots-on-the-ground operations, MACs provides the support backbone. It makes sure that when you have 5 different fire departments, the state EPA, and federal investigators all showing up and asking for resources, communication doesn't just completely collapse. MACs allows all those levels of government to assess the situation together, figure out the real priorities, and push critical resources like specialized HazMat teams or foam trucks exactly where they are needed the most.
So, we've covered the structure. You know the org chart, you know your training tiers, and you know how a response is supposed to scale up. But here is the ultimate question I want to leave you with for this section. What happens when the playbook gets completely thrown out the window in real life? Because talking about theory in a bright, safe classroom is one thing, but standing knee-deep in a hot zone at 2 in the morning is a whole different animal. Take a quick breather, grab some water, and when you come back, we are going to bridge this theory straight into hard reality. In Section 9, we're looking at real incident case studies. We'll see what happens when the incident command system works perfectly and what happens when it tragically fails. I'll see you in just a minute.
All right, let's pick right back up where we left off with your incident command system, because in this part of our training, we need to talk about what happens when things go wrong in the hot zone. I'm glad you're still with me, because this is exactly where theory meets reality. We've talked a lot about how to set up zones and prep your gear, but as anyone who has spent time on a hazardous waste site will tell you, well, the site doesn't always read the manual.
Look, you can have all the theoretical procedures in the world mapped out in a nice, neat binder, but out there on a site, reality is absolutely going to test you and your crew. What happens when the wind suddenly shifts? What happens when a backhoe hits an unmarked pocket of contaminated soil? The decisions you make in those first few chaotic minutes dictate whether your crew goes home safe or ends up as an OSHA case study. And to really understand why we treat these failures so seriously, we kind of have to look back at why we even have these rules in the first place.
You know, we didn't get these safety standards out of thin air. They were written after absolute disasters. Take Love Canal in New York, for example. The Hooker Chemical Company dumped roughly 21,000 tons of toxic chemical waste, we're talking chlorobenzenes, dioxins, you name it, into an old canal project, covered it up, and then a residential neighborhood and a school were literally built right on top of it. By the late 1970s, those chemicals were leaching into basements and playgrounds. It was a massive wake-up call that shocked the whole nation. And that kind of uncontrolled dumping forced the government's hand. First, the public outrage from Love Canal and places like the Valley of the Drums led to the creation of the Superfund program back in 1980, just to clean up these toxic nightmares. But early on, the men and women actually doing that cleanup, they had no uniform protection. They were walking into toxic soups with totally inconsistent gear. That's why in 1986, SARA mandated that OSHA create a specific standard to protect those workers. And that, my friends, is exactly how the HAZWOPER standard was born.
Now, here is where it gets incredibly frustrating for someone who's been doing this as long as I have. Even today, with all this history, all this training, and decades of the HAZWOPER standard backing us up, a quick look at OSHA's enforcement data shows a pretty embarrassing truth. We're still making the exact same mistakes in the field. Year after year, the same violations pop up. We're talking thousands of citations for hazard communication and respiratory protection. It just tells me that we are still dropping the ball on the basic stuff.
An OSHA standard is just ink on paper until you actually enforce it on your site. When you look at the real-world failures, people are getting hurt because we skip a basic respirator fit test, we lose our safety data sheets, or we just don't bother having a written hazard communication program. I've personally been on sites where guys are wearing respirators but haven't had a medical evaluation. That is literally a heart attack waiting to happen. These aren't just administrative typos, right? These are the exact failures that lead to real-world casualties.
To really drive this home, let's step into the hot zone and break down a real incident. This is a case study involving a midnight chemical process sampling spill that I actually used to train all my new safety officers. When you read through these incident reports, you quickly realize that accidents rarely happen because of one single massive error. No, they happen because a chain of small, lazy decisions finally catches up with you. Watch how this cascading failure happens step by step. So, we get a system upset at midnight. An operator goes out to take a sample. But instead of using a secure, closed-loop system, he drains a highly toxic chemical flush into an open, unvented bucket. Then, because the site isn't properly prepped and it's pitch black, he's wandering around blind looking for a waste disposal pit cover. And while he's moving the cover, he accidentally kicks the bucket. He had no portable air monitors, totally inadequate lighting, and the wrong equipment for the job. It's a straight path to a nightmare scenario.
The physical consequence of that chain of events? When he knocked over that bucket, the toxic content splashed up, causing severe chemical burns to his arms, his neck, and the lower half of his face. Every single ounce of that pain was completely preventable. The root causes are staring us right in the face here. No closed-loop sampling, zero air monitoring to tell him what he was breathing in the dark, and a total breakdown of administrative work practices. As a supervisor, your job is to sever that chain of failures before the bucket ever gets knocked over.
And this leads perfectly into one of the most common citations I see out in the field. As a site supervisor, you absolutely must know the difference between an incidental spill and an emergency response. It's night and day. An incidental spill is something minor, say a small puddle of a known low-hazard cleaner that your local maintenance crew can safely mop up. But an emergency response, that involves high toxicity, potential IDLH environments, and it requires a coordinated HAZWOPER evacuation and level A or B protection. Treating a true emergency like an incidental spill is exactly how you end up underprotecting your responders and getting people seriously hurt.
Listen up, because these are the lessons we learned the hard way. I like to call it the mentor's playbook. I've been doing this a long time and I see supervisors making the same tactical errors every single day. Number 1, selecting PPE based on the price tag instead of verified chemical compatibility charts. Number 2, handing me a generic copy-paste site safety and health plan that still has another company's name on it from a previous job. You also see crews failing to run continuous air monitoring during an active excavation or setting up a sloppy decon corridor without a real physical boundary. You cut corners here and the site will absolutely make you pay for it.
And that cheap PPE we just talked about, that's exactly where you run into deadly misunderstandings between permeation and degradation. Choosing the wrong suit based on cost leads directly to permeation. That's when a chemical dissolves right through the material on a molecular level. You can't even see it happening, but the worker inside is getting silently exposed. Degradation, on the other hand, is physical. That's when the chemicals, or even just sunlight, cause the fabric of your cheap suit to literally break down, pucker, and fall apart right there on the job. You have to match the suit material to the specific chemical hazard, for sure.
So how do you make sure you have the right gear, the right air monitors, and the right decon setup? It all comes back to your HAZP. A solid, strictly site-unique health and safety plan is your very first line of defense against the chaos we just analyzed. It can't be a useless binder full of fluff words. It needs your specific hazard analysis, your specific PPE selections, and your exact emergency response plans for that specific piece of dirt you are standing on. If the HAZP isn't tailored to your site, it honestly isn't worth the paper it's printed on.
All right, I want to leave you with this final thought. When things go wrong at 2 a.m., those theoretical plans won't save anyone. Are your air monitors actually calibrated? Is your HAZP specific to your site? Or did you just change the date on an old file? Your decisions are the only shield protecting your crew from becoming the next OSHA case study. Which side of the statistics will your team be on? Take a second, grab your notes, and get ready, because we're jumping straight into the recap quiz to test exactly what you've learned. I'll see you there.
All right, crew, let's take a breath. We just got through some seriously intense case studies, but this is where the rubber finally meets the road. I'm stepping out from behind the podium for a second to talk to you as someone who spent decades in the hot zone. Let's wrap up our HazWOPER masterclass, lock down the vital standards of 29 CFR 1910.120, and finish this explainer strong.
We just spent a lot of time looking at what happens when things go completely sideways. You've seen the disasters firsthand. What happens when communication breaks down, when air monitors get ignored, and when corners are cut. So now, we're going to review the core survival tactics to make sure you get it right. Because out there in the field, getting it right isn't about passing a final exam. It's about making absolutely sure you and your entire crew go home safe to your families at the end of the shift.
Let's do a quick recap of the 4 core pillars holding up our entire safety operation. Think of these as the concrete foundation of your house. If even one of these cracks, the whole operation comes down. We're talking about the HAZP, the Incident Command System, the Medical Surveillance Program, and our decon procedures. Every single regulation, every piece of gear, and every protocol we've discussed today ties directly back into one of these 4 pillars.
Okay, we need to lock this definition in, not just for the test, but for your life. IDLH, immediately dangerous to life or health. If an atmosphere is toxic, corrosive, or asphyxiating to the point that it poses an immediate threat, causes irreversible damage, or literally stops you from escaping, that is an IDLH environment. Take an oxygen deficiency below 19.5%, for example. If you hit that number, you don't mess around, you don't take a quick peek inside, and you definitely do not enter without supplied air, period.
Now notice the emphasis on the word tangible here. Your HAZP, your site-specific health and safety plan, isn't just a compliance box you check so OSHA leaves you alone. It is a tangible, written document. It is your ultimate survival guide. It outlines the exact hazard analysis for every task you're going to do, the specific PPE you need, and your precise work zones. If the HAZP says you need specific gear, you wear it, no exceptions. It's the playbook for keeping you alive on that exact patch of dirt.
Moving on to your physical well-being. A medical surveillance program establishes your health baseline before you ever step foot on a hazardous waste site. It kicks off with pre-employment screening, followed by periodic medical exams, and tracks your health over time. Why? Well, because many of these toxic chemicals, biological hazards, and radiation exposures, they don't drop you on the spot. They are silent. Medical surveillance makes sure the job isn't slowly making you sick without you even realizing it.
And here's the golden rule for decontamination. You establish your decon procedures and your decon line before anyone crosses into the hot zone. If that decon line isn't set up and ready to go, nobody goes in. It's that simple. Plus, here's a rule I want permanently burned into your memory. You never, ever take contaminated gear home to be washed. We do not bring the hot zone back to our living rooms, our washing machines, or our kids. We leave the hazard at the site.
All right, let's walk through a Monday morning scenario together. Put yourself in these boots. You're first on scene at an uncontrolled hazardous waste site. The air is a complete mystery. You have zero idea what's leaking, what's off-gassing, or what the oxygen levels are. So what are you telling your team to do? What is your very first operational move here? Think back to the pillars we just covered. If you said test the air, you are right on the money. Your initial move has to be atmospheric monitoring. You immediately test the air with direct reading instruments. You're deploying combustible gas meters to make sure you aren't walking into a bomb, plus your oxygen meters and detector tubes. But hey, it's not just about the gadgets. Notice that last bullet point? Visually observe. Keep your head on a swivel for visual hazards. Dead vegetation, weird vapor clouds, pooling liquids.
Your own eyes are your first line of defense against an IDLH condition.
Let's jump to our next drill. You're out there and your air monitors are absolutely screaming. Site characterization shows a very high respiratory hazard, so you definitely need top-tier breathing protection. But the chemical itself isn't highly corrosive to the skin. It's a lesser skin absorption threat. As the supervisor on deck, what level of protective gear are you pulling from the truck to authorize for your entry team?
The answer is level B. Take a mental snapshot of this breakdown because it is your ultimate cheat sheet for the exam and, more importantly, for the field. Level A is the highest everything. You've got the fully encapsulated suit and the SCBA. Level B gives you that exact same highest respiratory protection, the SCBA or supplied air, but you can drop down the skin protection slightly to a chemical-resistant suit. Level C drops your breathing protection down to an air-purifying respirator or APR. And Level D, that's basically your standard construction work clothes.
And that brings us to a fatal trap that catches way too many people. Listen closely. If you do not know exactly what is in the air, or if you know the oxygen level is below 19.5%, an air purifying respirator is not going to save you. An APR simply filters the air, it doesn't supply oxygen. If there's no oxygen to breathe, filtering it does absolutely nothing. So in unknown or oxygen-deficient atmospheres, Level C is completely off the table. You need supplied air every time.
Okay, scenario number 3. All hell breaks loose. A massive chemical spill happens at a local industrial park. Fire trucks, police, environmental agencies, and your HazMat crew all rush in. Pure chaos is brewing and everyone is trying to shout orders at once. According to our HAZWOPER standards, who is the single person that steps up to take control, reduce the confusion, and actually enforce the safety rules?
It's the incident commander, the IC. When you're operating under the incident command system, you need one person in charge to bring order to the chaos. The IC establishes the main objectives, strictly enforces the use of proper PPE, and directs all response operations through a very clear chain of command. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean they're the highest-ranking political person in the city. It means they're the single point of operational authority managing the safety and tactics of that specific incident, so nobody goes rogue and gets themselves killed.
When you look at it, OSHA's regulations and the incident command system work perfectly hand in hand. OSHA provides the framework for worker protection, things like medical surveillance, the required training, and the PPE levels. ICS, on the other hand, provides the operational backbone on the ground. Together, they replace emergency chaos with strict, life-saving order. They ensure that from the moment you step out of the truck to the moment you wrap up the post-emergency cleanup, there is a coordinated plan protecting your life.
Look, crew, here is some true veteran wisdom straight from the manual. Conditions can suddenly change. I've personally seen a safe zone turn IDLH in 90 seconds flat, just because the wind shifted and a secondary container breached. Never, ever get complacent. Just because your air monitor was reading zeros 20 minutes ago does not mean you're safe right now. Continual, ongoing air monitoring is an absolute requirement, because your safe zone can turn deadly in a heartbeat.
Before we wrap this up, let's quickly review your training classifications. If you're a general site worker heavily involved in cleanup, you need the 40-hour initial training plus 3 days of supervised field experience. If you're an occasional visitor with limited exposure, you need the 24-hour training plus 1 day in the field. And for all of us, no matter our level or rank, we must complete our 8-hour refresher every single year to maintain competency and certification. This training isn't a one-and-done deal. It's a career-long commitment to safety.
You guys have put in the hours, you've learned the regulations, and you've run the scenarios. Out in the hot zone, it's not just about passing an exam. It's about looking out for the person to your left and the person to your right. Thanks for taking this explainer seriously. Be sure to like and subscribe for more safety training. But before you clock in tomorrow, I want you to ask yourself, if the alarms sound on your site right now, are you genuinely ready to be the one who gets everyone home alive? Stay sharp out there, look out for each other, and I'll see you in the field.